Welcome to Manifested Publishers.
How are you, everyone? And welcome to the Manifested e-learning forum. The subject is advanced portfolio management. We continue with the first chapter, which is managing individual portfolios and institutional investors. We are currently studying the management of individual portfolios. The subtopic is investor characteristics. Investor characteristics. We previously said that investor characteristics can be categorized into two: situational profiling and psychological profiling. We've covered situational profiling in our previous sessions. In our today's lesson, we are going to look into psychological profiling. Psychological profiling. Psychological profiling. Psychological profiling. And remember, profiling is simply the categorization of investors. And learners, we saw that before an investment manager or an investment advisor prepares an investment policy statement for an individual, the advisor has to make effort to understand the investor first through situational profiling, and now we want to consider psychological profiling. Psychological profiling. Now, psychological profiling is a determinant of individual investing. And this psychological profiling has generally received less focus than the situational profiling. Learners, psychological profiling is a determinant of individual investing that has generally received less focus than situational profiling. It's a more objective influence on the psychological processes by which an individual establishes his or her investment preferences. Learners, every individual brings to the investment decision-making process an objective set of financial circumstances, goals, and constraints that will strongly influence the set of investment alternatives from which he chooses. Every individual will do what? Will bring to the investment decision process making an objective set of circumstances, an objective set of goals, and a set of constraints. And the goals, the constraints, and the circumstances will strongly influence the set of investment alternatives that individual will choose from. And yet, learners, underlying the behavioral patterns and the personality characteristics, okay, the underlying behavioral patterns and personality characteristics will often play a very important role in setting individual risk tolerance and tolerance and return objectives. So, psychological profiling sometimes bridges the differences between traditional finance and behavioral finance. Psychological profiling which is sometimes referred to as personality typing, bridges the difference between traditional finance and behavioral finance. Traditional finance. Now, learners, traditional finance, which in some literature you find it being referred to as the modern portfolio theory. The modern portfolio theory. Now, much of the standard history of economic and financial theory rests on the philosophy that financial market participants are rational. Okay? The financial participants are rational. Number one, they are rational. We are saying that the traditional finance, what we are referring to as the modern portfolio theory, much of the standard history of economic and the financial theory rests on philosophy that the financial participants are, number one, rational. Number two, they are information-based investors. They are information-based investors. They are information-based investors with dispassionate objectives that maximize the expected utility of wealth. And in the models of traditional or standard investment decision making, investors are assumed to exhibit, these are assumptions, investors are assumed to exhibit risk aversion. They exhibit risk aversion. They exhibit risk, these are assumptions. They exhibit risk aversion. Number two, they hold rational expectations. The second assumption, they hold rational expectations. They hold rational expectations. And lastly, investors are assumed to practice asset integration. they assume to practice asset integration. Asset integration. Now, what do you mean by risk aversion? Risk aversion. We've said that in traditional models or standard investment decision making, investors are assumed to, number one, exhibit risk aversion. Number two, they assume to hold rational expectations. Number three, they assume to practice asset integration. Asset integration. So now, risk aversion, learners, implies that investors with otherwise equivalent investment options will prefer the investment with the lowest volatility. They'll choose an investment with a certain outcome over an investment with an uncertain outcome that has the same expected value. That's what we mean by risk aversion. And holding rational expectations means that investors are coherent, investors are accurate, investors are unbiased forecasters. Their forecast will reflect all relevant information, and they will learn from their past mistakes. That is a rational human being. A rational person is one who considers all the information before making a decision, is one who is coherent, is one who is accurate, the one who is not biased. He is a forecaster who integrates all the information, and is an investor who learns not only from his own past mistakes, but from mistakes of other investors. That is a rational investor. So under the traditional model, the investment decision-making investors is assumed to hold rational expectations. How about practicing asset integration? What is asset integration? Learners, asset integration refers to the process by which investors choose among risky investments. Learners, is a process by which investors do what? Choose among risky investments. And these investors practice asset integration by comparing the portfolio return versus risk. Okay? Portfolio return stroke risk distributions that result from combining various investment opportunities. Now, learners, assets are evaluated under asset integration. Assets are evaluated in the context of their impact on the aggregate investment portfolio, not as standalone investments. And as a consequence of the traditional assumptions about individual economic behavior, the traditional models of portfolio building processes have historically relied on asset pricing, which is driven by economic considerations such as production costs and prices of substitutes. Furthermore, portfolios are constructed holistically. Portfolios are done what? Portfolios are constructed holistically, reflecting covariances between assets and overall objectives plus constraints. That's all, learners, I can say in regard to traditional finance. Remember, we are studying psychological profiling, and we started by indicating that psychological profiling bridges the difference between traditional finance, which you've discussed. Let's now shift gears to behavioral finance. Behavioral finance. Learners, a growing body of research points to differences in behavior caused by differences in how individuals approach uncertain situations. There is an ongoing research, a growing body of research, which points to differences in behavior caused by differences in how individuals approach situations. People cannot behave in the same way. People behave differently under uncertain situations. So, learners, psychological considerations appear to play an important role in guiding investor behavior, especially during periods of stress. And there is a lot of work that has been done by authorities in that regard. Individuals like Robert Shiller, individuals like Daniel Kahneman, all right? Individuals like Amos Saki, and many others. These individuals have firmly established the field of behavioral finance as a cornerstone of investment policy. And we've seen several investment firms that incorporate behavioral finance in their investment policy. And the decision-making models, learners attempt to incorporate the principles of behavioral finance. And that is the realm in which individual investors are recognized. So in studying behavioral finance, learners, we learn that individuals exhibit loss aversion. Individuals exhibit, this is behavioral finance, individuals exhibit what we call loss aversion. Individuals exhibit loss aversion. Individuals exhibit loss aversion. Individuals also hold biased expectations. They hold biased expectations. Individuals hold biased expectations, and they also practice what we call asset segregation. They practice asset segregation. They practice asset segregation. Now, loss aversion is demonstrated when investors evaluate opportunities in terms of gain or loss rather than in terms of uncertainty with respect to terminal wealth. And faced with the choice between, we are talking about loss aversion, loss aversion. Loss aversion. When individuals are faced with the choice between, when individuals are faced with the choice between, one, a certain loss on one hand and an uncertain outcome, and two, an uncertain outcome. When individuals are faced with choice between, one, a certain loss on one hand, and two, an uncertain outcome that might produce a smaller loss, but whose expected value is a larger loss, investors are likely to exhibit loss aversion by choosing the uncertain alternative. And learners choosing the uncertain outcome actually demonstrates risk-seeking behavior. Risk-seeking behavior. And traditional finance predicts that investors, being risk-averse, should choose the certain loss over an alternative whose expected loss is larger. That's what we mean by loss aversion. That's the meaning of loss aversion. How about biased expectations? Biased expectations results from the cognitive errors and misplaced confidence in one's ability to assess the future. And examples of cognitive errors include mistaking the skills of the average manager for those of a particular manager. That is overestimating the significance of low probability events. That's another example. Overestimating the significance of low probability events. Another example could be overestimating overestimating the representativeness of one asset, okay, compared with another asset. Those are biases. I've given examples. I've said they result from cognitive errors. Cognitive refers to the mind, the thinking, individuals thinking in error, individuals having misplaced confidence in one's ability to assess the future. There are those who think they can predict the future with certainty. Like my friend called me the other day and told me that macadamia is the real thing, was advising me to invest in macadamia. And he was very confident. And that's an individual who's never gone to any financial management or investment management class, but he thinks he can advise people on investments. Those are examples you are referring to as biased expectations. Cognitive errors and misplaced confidence in one's ability to assess the future. I've given examples of mistaking the skills of an average manager for those of a professional manager. We have investors who seek investment advice from professionals. So those investors who cannot even make correct judgment on an average investment advisor and a professional investment advisor. So those are cognitive errors, okay? They hold what? Biased expectations. Then practice asset segregation. Asset segregation. What is asset segregation? Now, learners, asset segregation is the evaluation of investment choices individually rather than in aggregate. From the word segregate, is to divide. Okay, instead of evaluating investment choices in aggregate, investors may evaluate investment choices individually. And related behavior includes reference. We call it what? We call it reference dependence. Dependence includes reference dependence, in which economic behavior is shaped by the frame of reference or the context in which choices are presented. And what we normally call mental counting. It's a good word right there. Mental accounting. Biased expectations. We are now on asset segregation. We've discussed biased expectations. We are now on asset segregation. And I've mentioned a term there, mental accounting. You may have come across this term in your past papers where students were asked to define mental accounting. That is simply, mental accounting is simply organizing investments into separate psychological accounts depending on purpose or preference. And according to behavioral approach or behavioral models of individual decision making, learners, portfolio construction takes place under a more complex set of assumptions, than those previously given. Asset pricing reflects both economic considerations such as production costs, the prices of substitutes, and also subjective individual considerations such as tastes and preferences and fears. And learners, portfolios are constructed as pyramids of assets, layer by layer, in which each layer reflects certain goals and constraints. And within this behavioral framework, individuals also have characteristics that will either sharpen or blunt the human tendencies for risk avoidance. And in our next session, we'll be discussing the process of what we call personality typing, which seeks to identify and categorize these characteristics to facilitate the discussion of risk and risk tolerance. So the primary value of personality typing, I had mentioned it somewhere here. Personality typing. The primary value of personality typing is to provide both the investor and the manager. The investor and the manager. By manager, I'm referring to the investment advisor. The investment advisor. The personality typing, which is just categorization, learners, okay, of having investors into categories, into types. It provides the investor and the manager with a framework for thinking about the influence of personality on investment decision making. And the purpose is not to merely or to neatly categorize investors into arbitrarily defined personality types. No, the purpose, the objective of coming up with the personality types is to provide both the investor and the investment advisor or the manager with the framework for thinking about the influence of personality on investment decision making. And learners, don't forget, we are in the first topic of advanced portfolio management. And what we are studying now is what is very important to an investment advisor before an investment advisor develops an investment policy for an individual investor. An individual investor is important to understand the investor, all right? And that can be done through investor characteristics, which we said can be categorized into two: situational profiling and psychological profiling. So we take a break, In our next lesson, we will proceed with the personality typing. Thank you. But before we take a break, before I say bye-bye, I want to give you your today's revision questions. So, learners, I have 3 revision questions for you today. Number 1, state 3 approaches to psychological profiling. Number 2, state 3 assumptions of modern portfolio theory. Number 3, define the following: A, loss aversion; B, asset segregation; C, risk aversion; D, asset integration; and E, rational expectations. Please go through this lesson one more time. Take notes. Then when doing the assignment, close the notebook. Try and see if you can recall what you have learned in our today's lesson from your memory. Actively recall what you have learned in our today's lesson. Thank you for your time. In our next lesson, we will be studying personality typing. And remember, personality typing, I just mentioned in this lesson, that seeks to identify and categorize those characteristics of investors, the characteristics of investors, so as to facilitate discussion of risk and risk tolerance. We will look into detail in that subject in our next lesson. Bye-bye. God bless you.